Hey guys, so I wanted to make this video for a long time, and before we get to the part, I just would like to mention that I don't think I'm an expert at all in this specific field, maybe business, economics, or anything else. But I do have a master's degree, and I think these are some of the things that I've seen here because I've been living here for a long time. When I say here, I mean in Europe. I've traveled to multiple countries, and I would say that there is a similar kind of pattern that I see in most of the places. So there is no denying that Europe itself has built one of the best places to live. And I think there are some things here, especially from institutions' perspective, that is kind of protecting the established systems itself rather than creating new capacities or so. So I feel that the central problem is like you already have too much regulations, but at the same time, instead of creating new things, you are thinking of protecting the old systems that you have, okay? And even when the new things are coming up, you are trying to create rules and without even starting the development part at all. So for example, that you think that you can protect something but without the execution part or so. Maybe for some of you it doesn't make sense, right? So to give a core example of this thing, imagine that you are a country which has never played, or let's say has ever had a field for football or so. And it makes sense to have some regulations and everything else about those, right? But if you never build a field or so, you will never be able to play football, right? But you can keep making regulations and rules about it. Okay, if we construct one day, we should do this or we should do that. And if some other people come around from other countries or so, you can put that regulation on those as well if they would like to build the same systems in your country or so. So maybe I guess you understand like where I'm trying to go from here, right? So one of the things I would also like to mention, like maybe people will say, oh, but Europe is not one country, no? It's basically a bunch of other countries or so combined together. So yeah, man, I totally understand because I've been living here. I'm not saying that it's only one giant country or so. There are multiple countries, multiple cultures, multiple languages, and everything else. But especially we call it European Union. So that's my point. And the kind of problems that you face are not just one country is facing them and the rest of them are not facing in Europe. For example, one of the biggest example is that we have a big real estate crisis, right? And it's not something which is, let's say, only restricted to Lisbon, Prague, or some other country or so. These systems, or let's say these regulations, were built in a way that the older generation could maybe, let's say, buy a house, get a definite pension, they can raise kids on a single pension or so, or let's say, or a single salary or so. This kind of system was only meant for those states. Right now, we have this system of endless growth that is going on. So, if you think about all of these conditions, and you already know that how the situation is tied up to the current demographics or so. So, you already have a decline in the rate of birth. People don't have money, especially people in generation, which is our generation, which is essentially the people in 20s, 30s or so. You would understand that the median age to get out of their parents' house is exploding so much because technically nobody can actually afford a rent. Even if your salary is, let's say, on median, it's very hard to actually rent a place and then be able to afford all the necessities like groceries, further expenses, like utilities, and then still be able to have enough money left for yourself and then think about your family itself. So, one of the things that you could think about is also that, especially let's take an example of Portugal or Lisbon or so, they have this crisis specifically regarding real estate or so. Now, a lot of people actually blame the immigrants, but if you think about it, immigrants, well, it's an easy target to just blame everything on the immigrants or so, right? But according to their own statistics, that's not the case. First of all, the bureaucracy that it requires to build a single house is years. And on top of that, they don't have enough supply. So that's one of the causes, right? Because houses were a safe investment for everybody or so. And now, in this generation for now, one of their biggest problem from bureaucracy perspective is also the abandoned houses or so. So I don't know where I read the stat like a long time ago or so that they have like 500,000 or so. It's a big number or so. They have these many amounts of houses which are completely empty in city areas, and they are either abandoned because nobody's taking care of them. Second, they are caught up in the property disputes or so. Third, people are just people who have generational wealth or people who have money. This I'm counting all the people. This is not just immigrants. I'm talking about also people in Portugal who actually have multiple houses or so, and they're For example, if you just go to a real estate website or so, you could see that how much is the demand and how much is the prices. So, for example, a T2 apartment, which is basically an apartment with two rooms or so, are going 400,000, 500,000 or so. And these buildings are from 1970s or 80s. So there is not just one factor. So imagine that if you're thinking about real estate or so and you're creating all these regulations, but you're not managing the supply and demand, you will never come out of this problem, right? The young generation will never be able to afford these houses. The other problem is if you think about another thing, that how fast Europe moves in terms of just creating the regulations also. GDPR is a very good example of this thing, right? So imagine that you are a company like Google, which has thousands of employees, and then you have a company who has maybe, let's say, 10 or 20 employees or so. So GDPR was kind of, let's say, applied to make sure that, okay, the privacy is kept, there are some regulations and everything else. But how many people living in Europe actually like it? So there are two sectors to it. One is that you have a huge company which can actually do everything. There is a fixed cost to it and it can be handled by thousands of people because you have the infrastructure for it, you have the lawyers, you can do the audits or so. But then think about the cost from 4 person or 5 people who are working in a small startup or so, or imagine even 20 people or so. You don't have the resources to go after every small detail or so. And even if you do, for example, you see these banners, right? Whenever you're visiting the website or so. If these banners, there are studies proving this thing that if the banners are from bigger websites like Google, Facebook, YouTube, or something like that, people are just willing to accept it because how many times it has happened that you open a website or so and there are like thousands of pop-ups and people just accept it because it's like, I don't want to deal with this thing. So you could think about it as like, although this was meant to improve the life of the people, it kind of didn't. And there are studies post 2018 actually proving that small tech vendors or like small tech startups actually lost their reach. And some of them even have exited the market because they cannot sustain this kind of marketing. Only a fair share of Google and big startups or like big companies can actually go through all the regulations and make it possible for the people or so. And not just from this, but especially a part of, let's say, from shopping experience, from buying things, from online orders or so, there have been research which critically shows that venture deals have actually dropped roughly a quarter for these people ever since GDPR was applied. So essentially, that we were very good at creating the regulations or so, but we never think about, okay, what is the, let's say, downside of this thing happening? Is it actually going to favor small people, or is it actually going, not small but small companies or so, or maybe local people, or is it going to create hurdles which can only be cleared by big companies or so because they have the resources for it? Another thing, a very good example of this thing is also that imagine that how many people in Europe is actually going outside of their comfort zone and actually investing in stock market also. The number of that percentage is very tiny or so, because as far as I read the number, it's like we have like this 30 trillion amount of 30 trillion euros or so in the saving accounts sitting in. Because one thing I have learned from traveling all the countries and like talking to all these people here is that they don't really believe in that. Essentially you could say that it's a gambling market or so, but it's like it's a crazy number to think about that, because most of the Europeans, the wealth is kind of concentrated in real estate, maybe a little bit of gold, and maybe in their saving account or so. That's pretty much it. Although this number has been changing recently because a lot more people are, let's say, exposed to the side of investment or so, from ads, from advertisements, from YouTube, from Instagram, and other social media or so. So this number has been quite changing for a long time now, but it's still not at any of the peak. Another very good example is that since I mentioned before that technically you cannot think of it as a single country or so, it's supposed to be, let's say, an organization of multiple countries or so. But to take this as an example, like how far behind they are in certain things, is that countries like Brazil, India, which have like a higher population, like such a high population or so, you can technically say that, okay, it's because one country they are able to do it, but they have built system of payments which can be used by different states. Because if you think about India, it's basically not one country or so. If you think that it has 29 states or so, the population is massive or so, and people speak different languages, people have different cultures, people actually eat different kind of foods, they actually have different governments as well. But even after so, they are able to create one single payment interface which works along everywhere or so. How is it possible that even now, although I know that we have been having these kind of discussions, that there are some companies coming across which are trying to integrate, for example, you have MBWay from Portugal, there are others as well, which are trying to have one single interface to pay at any country or so. But to think that in 2026, even after being a union or so, we don't have a single payment method or so. So that's why you are so much dependent on, let's say, payment interfaces like MasterCard, Visa, because, well, there is no single solution for it. And how many people actually travel from cross country? Like, for example, people going to Spain to France, coming from France to Portugal. How could you think that there is actually no single payment gateway? Because, well, there is no innovation on that front, right? Because of the bureaucracy. One other thing is also that if you think about the outsourcing of sovereignty. So, for example, Germany decided that it's going to close its nuclear plants or so, right? And this is in terms when you know that there needs to be a lot more energy required, right? And this happened during the war as well, that they closed a bunch of nuclear plants or so, then they were financing through Russian gas and everything else. So I don't want to get into the political details of it, but it's like most of the industry was kind of focused on energy, defense, and maybe you have a couple of outliers. For example, from Netherlands, you have ASML, which is basically it builds the machines and the chip and everything else. So it's a very good thing if you want to read about it because it's one of the only, let's say, companies which is able to do it. But lately, what is the number of these kind of companies happening so, right? And how there is like such a, let's say, they're so far apart in these things. For example, if you have an example of France where energy is being primarily derived from nuclears, and then you have countries like Germany which is completely doing the opposite, that they're shutting the nuclear plants or so. So you can see like how much of a difference does it make that one country is doing completely different from the other countries or so, even with all the scientific evidence we have for the nuclear plants or so. The other thing is, for example, it's a very good example is that a lot of these countries, although it's not a very high number, for example, some countries like Portugal have a GDP dependence of, let's say, 10 to 15%. It's a big exposure for, if you think about it, for Portugal, Spain, or Greece to be technically dependent on tourism or so. And I don't think it's a huge number, but it's still time. I think it's a good enough number, right? If you think about it, like your country is totally dependent, like 10 to 15% of the GDP, because we have seen the cases as pandemic happened that how much is the struggle here for people who are working in tourism, and it's like a similar culture or so, and especially in countries like Spain and Greece. Like Greece has been facing this kind of issue for a long time, especially with Airbnbs or so, and it's the same in Portugal and Spain, to the extent that Spain has to ban Airbnbs in certain areas or so. And this just doesn't lead to this kind of dependence on one specific service or so. It also creates this culture of brain drain, where example that people from a country, like the brilliant mind of the country, are going to emigrate to other countries or so because they feel like, well, the money is not enough for me. I cannot sustain myself. I cannot have an apartment. I cannot make a family. I cannot sustain for the kids. I can't even live by myself, which results in again the brain draining of the whole country or so. The part here is that technically you could say that all these regulations or so, maybe we can tone it down, but it's also think about that. For example, what happens is if you are not the first one in terms of innovation or so, what ends up happening is that you have this kind of compounding effect that, for example, USA decides, which is whatever you want to say about the land of the frees, but it's like they come up with these innovations, right? So for example, you have OpenAI, you have DeepMind, you have Anthropic or so, and they come up with these models, they come up with these new things always. And who ends up actually regulating them? Because they are having the first mover advantage, right? Because people are moving, things are going to break, but at least they are working. On the other hand, Europe, well, as far as apart from Mistral, I don't know if any other big companies are actually trying to maybe let's say even compete on the same front or so. But what do we end up doing is we end up just regulating all of these stuff, right? And what does this regulation actually leads to? It leads to that a lot of people here can't even access the latest model or so because it's like it's not just possible because we are like because we have so many regulations we will not be able to access this thing, right? And even though recently Europe has come across, or let's say a few countries have said that, okay, we are going to invest a lot more money in building the capacity and providing more money for AIs and everything else. But it's like, if your research industry is, let's say, behind for a couple of years or so, it's not very easy to catch up. For example, imagine that your competitor who is in advantageous position of doing 2 to 3 years of R&D or so, suddenly you cannot catch up on this thing because you need raw materials, you need good brains, like people who actually understand these stuff. You need to pay them very well enough to actually be having them. Secondly, you need people from all other countries also. For example, USA has been known for this, that a lot of people go from different countries there because like the salaries are good, things move fast even though things break, but at least they have the first mover advantage or so. So all of these things, apart from the crisis that we are seeing, that how a lot of countries in Europe are having this kind of pension system crisis, where it's basically that the scheme was never meant for right now, where that the demographic is changing so much that earlier you had these people, whereas let's say young generation used to be a higher percentage or so, and now because of all the issues or crises we are having, the population is completely reversing, because in most of the countries in Europe you have this reverse trend, which is basically that you're going to have more older people compared to the younger people. And when you have this kind of situation, technically you cannot, let's say, foresee what's going to happen, or let's say at least you are able to foresee, but you cannot manage the pension system or so. Because imagine what's going to happen in next 20 or 30 years when you have less young people contributing to social security. And then when the time comes for these young people, because the population is declining already, right? And I'm not sure, like, I do know that there are certain things that Europe can do, especially in these regards or so, but I guess essentially the point comes up to this, because I wanted to do this video to be specifically about like what are the problems here, and maybe we can also do a series of what do you guys think like would be the solutions for these kind of things, because we have a lot of regulations, we have a lot of fragmentation, we have these industries which are focused on service, for example consultants, people providing services, but instead of actually creating some kind of manufacturing itself which is essentially used, or even from the innovation perspective or so. So I guess to summarize this thing is that there needs to be some kind of transformation. And one last example I would also like to give is that we are also facing one of the biggest problem with car industry as well, if you think about it, that recently Volkswagen came out and said that they are going to cut about 100,000 jobs or so. So this used to be like the pinnacle of Germany and every other, let's say, example for every other country or so, like how well they were doing, because well they had the uphold of all the car market here in Europe. And they are struggling with the Chinese market also, because well China is giving so many good cars, maybe the industry is subsidized by their own government or so, but well they have been doing very well. So yeah, I wanted to make this video specifically to highlight these problems or so, and I want like to understand from what do you guys think would are some more problems that you feel about them, and also what could be the solutions for these kind of things. And that's all for today, I guess. See you guys in the next one. Ciao.